You all would have noticed that the proponents of capitalism like to claim that communist regimes in the 20th century murdered around 100 million people. They make this claim repeatedly because they think it gives them moral superiority and a justifiable reason to dismiss Marxist ideas. For example,
you said you're a communist, which does have a death toll of 100 million people in the last 100 years. So shamelessly tell us what countries work so well under
Go on this claim you often hear the radical leftists make about communism, about Marxism. They say, well, that wasn't real Marxism. It's like, okay, well, how many countries do you need to disprove your thesis? How many millions of people have to die before you might admit that you're wrong? Well, obviously more than 100 million, because that's the approximate total. That's probably an underestimate, but we'll be conservative, because adding another 10 million doesn't really make that much difference.
Notice how these writers treat the 100 million death figure like it is a historical fact. Peterson, without a shred of evidence, was even willing to increase the death toll in order to strengthen his point. This alone should tell you that these people don't care about historical facts, just political point scoring. For example, to back up their claims that 100 million people were killed under Marxist governments, they tend to cite the Black Book of Communism, which is where the 100 million death figure comes from. Now, what these right-wing propagandists, of course, ignore is the fact that this estimated death toll was heavily disputed by academia. In fact, criticism even came from the contributing authors of the book, such as Nicholas Wirth and John Lewis Magolan, who publicly distanced themselves from the 100 million death count figure. Wirth and Magolan even accused the primary author of the Black Book, Stéphane Courtois, of being obsessed with arriving at the total of 100 million killed. So those who cite the 100 million figure are simply taking advantage of poor and sloppy scholarship. Now, even if the Black Book's dubious figure was true, this wouldn't give right-wing pundits the moral superiority they so desperately crave. The reason for this is that the death toll of capitalism, the economic system they love and support, would have beaten communism's alleged death count many times over. Now, before we discuss the deaths caused by capitalism, we must define what capitalism is. Capitalism is an economic system that is based on the private ownership of the means of production and their operation for profit. It is characterized by wage labor or forced labor if they can get away with it, producing for the purposes of selling, aka commodity production, and of course capital accumulation. The capitalists themselves are those who own the means of production. What are the means of production? The industries that produce goods that the capitalist tries to sell on the market for the best price he can get. As for the workers, they must accept the conditions set by the capitalist or go hungry. This gives the capitalist great control over the workforce. Therefore, under capitalism you will find that the owners of the means of production can fulfill their needs many times over, whilst others cannot. Of course, in order to defend such inequalities, the capitalists either need a powerful state or a private army to maintain their economic power. Therefore, it is easy to conclude that capitalism is based on the pursuit of naked self-interest. In fact, the so-called philosopher of capitalism, Adam Smith, believed that an individual acting in their own self-interest can unwittingly benefit society as a whole. To quote Smith directly, "The rich consume little more than the poor, and in spite of their natural selfishness and rapacity, they divide with the poor the produce of all their improvements. They are led by an invisible hand to make nearly the same distribution of the necessaries of life which would have been made had the earth been divided into equal portions among all its inhabitants, and thus, without intending it, without knowing it, advance the interests of the society, and afford means to the multiplication of the species." Now, whilst one could argue that people acting in their self-interest could create incentives and promote innovation, it is hard to deny that this mindset has also caused the death of millions in both the 19th and 20th centuries. In fact, capitalists pursuing their own interests has led to a great misallocation of resources, exploitation, and of course mass death. Furthermore, capitalists have also shown no hesitation using the power of the state to crush those who are a threat to their economic interests, whether the threat comes from Marxists, trade unions, indigenous people, or even landless peasants. So how should we calculate the death toll of capitalism? While it is clear that we will never have an exact number, but we can certainly say that it runs well into the hundreds of millions. German academic Thomas Pogge estimates that in the 15 years after the Cold War, 270 million, 18 million a year, perished due to terrible poverty. This includes those who have died from poor sanitation, starvation, and a lack of medical care. Now, why is that the fault of capitalism? Well, we live in the era of neoliberalism, where the world is one large market, so capitalism is completely global. Big capitalist multinationals dominate the world economy, and capital easily flows across national borders. Furthermore, modern industry, controlled by capitalists, produce more than enough food and other essential goods to completely end world hunger and poverty. Yet this does not happen. Why? Because under capitalism, the world's impoverished citizens are not seen as people who need desperate help, but rather as unpaying customers who cannot afford goods and services. After all, it is in the capitalist's self-interest to derive profits from their assets. Using their great economic power to help the desperately poor would be completely unprofitable. Now, this mindset has always prevailed under capitalism, especially in the 19th century, which is when capitalism really became dominant. For example, during the Irish potato famine of the 1840s and 50s, British landlords continued to export food for profit rather than feed the starving Irish. Now, why would they do this? Because exporting food was far more profitable than helping penniless Irish peasants and workers. After all, it is in the capitalist's self-interest to sell their produce at the best price they can get. Now, as I said, in the Imperial Age, this economic behaviour by capitalists was pretty typical. Capitalists who were backed by colonial governments would use the indigenous people of the conquered territories as a source of cheap labour. When the products were ready, the capitalists would then export the goods in order to sell them on more lucrative markets. This often, like in the Irish example, resulted in famine and mass death. To give another example, in the man-made famines of British India, more than enough food was being produced to feed the Indian population. However, both the landlords and the British government preferred to sell these goods on the world market, where they would receive a much greater profit. So in British India, you had a situation where tons of food was being exported, whilst millions of Indians, those who had harvested the grain, were starving on the streets. Now, according to Mike Davis, author of late Victorian Holocausts, El Nino Famines, and the Making of the Third World, between 12 and 29 million Indians starved to death between 1876 and 1902. Now, when we talk about the mass exploitation in the pursuit of profit in the 19th century, it is impossible to ignore the Congo Free State, which was not controlled by the Belgium government, but by a single capitalist, Leopold II. In that nation, the entire population was put to work extracting rubber and ivory for the benefit of one man. Now, whilst Leopold II became one of the richest men in the world by selling Congo's natural resources on the world market, the people who were actually extracting these resources were being killed, tortured, and starved to death. In fact, it is estimated that up to 10 million Congolese were killed during Leopold's reign of terror. Now, my critics would suggest that I am simply attributing the deaths caused by colonialism to capitalism. Well, according to Cecil Rhodes, a capitalist and imperialist, one of the motivations of imperial conquest was about securing new markets. To quote Rhodes, "In order to save 40 million inhabitants in the United Kingdom from bloody civil war, our statesmen must acquire new lands for settling the surplus population of this country, to provide new markets for the goods produced in the factories and mines. The empire, as I have always said, is a bread and butter question. If you want to avoid civil war, you must become imperialist." The British politician and businessman Joseph Chamberlain, Secretary of State for the Colonies, also shared this view. In a speech in 1893, Chamberlain attacked anti-imperialists as Little Englanders who were against opening up fresh markets for British commerce. To quote him directly, If the Little Englanders had their way, not only would they refrain from taking the legitimate opportunities which offer for extending the empire and for securing for us new markets, but I doubt whether they would even take the pains which are necessary to preserve the great heritage which has come down to us from our ancestors. Yes, according to Chamberlain and Rhodes, one of the primary motivations for imperialism was to secure new markets where British capitalists would be able to sell their products, as well as exploit cheap labour. So in the 19th century, capitalism was largely spread through the barrel of a gun. Take the Opium Wars. In the 1830s, British and other European traders had flooded the Chinese black market with opium, a drug that had been banned in China since 1799. In 1839, the Chinese government responded by confiscating 20 chests of opium from British ships and refused to compensate the British traders who had been flouting Chinese law for decades. The British responded by attacking the Chinese, which started the First Opium War. The British won the war in 1842 and forced the Chinese to sign the Treaty of Nanking, which ceded Hong Kong to the British Empire, as well as forcing China to open up several ports to British traders. Now, when the British and other Western powers won the Second Opium War, which occurred between 1856 and 1860, they forced China, in accordance with the Convention of Peking, to legalize the opium trade and open more ports to Western traders. Now, why would the British and other Western powers want to legalize the opium trade? Because opium was addictive, which meant that there would always be willing customers. Of course, the result was that by 1900, 90 million Chinese were addicted to opium. So the evidence is pretty conclusive about capitalism's very close relationship with murderous and exploitive imperialism in the 19th century. Seeking markets so their merchants and capitalists could profit was very important to the imperialist powers in that era. In fact, it was even important in the 20th century. For example,
in the 50s, the Guatemalans dared to challenge an American business that controlled much of its economy. The United Fruit Company of Boston owned 500,000 acres of land, the railroad, the port, and telecommunications. But most Guatemalan peasants found it difficult to survive. In 1950, Jacobo Arbenz was voted president. He wasn't a communist, but some of his close allies were. A former military man, Arbenz sought to modernize Guatemala's backward society. Washington was alarmed. President Arbenz started a land reform program, buying up fallow land to distribute to peasants. In compensation, he offered the landowners the values they had themselves declared for taxes. United Fruit was offered just over $1 million for its land. When Arbenz declared nationalization, the company, backed by the United States, claimed $16 million.
No less a figure than John Foster Dulles, head of the State Department, was part of the firm of lawyers acting for the United Fruit Company. His brother Alan was the head of the CIA. So it didn't take much of an effort on their part to persuade their president, a military man, Mr. Eisenhower, to give them the green light to overthrow Arbenz's government.
Now you see this repeated throughout the history of the 20th century. Iran in 1953, the Suez Crisis in 1956, Brazil in 1964, Chile in 1973, and so on. Furthermore, almost the exact same type of exploitation that occurred in the 19th century still goes on today. For example, why do you think capitalists often set up shop in third world countries? Do they do this because the workers in Western countries are inferior to those in the third world? Of course not. The reason why they choose to have their goods manufactured in third world countries like Bangladesh is because it is far cheaper. In the countries they choose to manufacture their products in, pay is very poor and regulations are lax. Of course, this results in incidents like the Rana Plaza collapse, which killed over 1,000 people because the owner had bypassed building regulations. The factories at the plaza, of course, were manufacturing clothes for some of the world's leading brands. So the problems with capitalism in the 19th century are still around in the 21st. Now why is this the case? Is it because capitalists are naturally evil? The answer is no. It is the system that is the problem. The capitalists must stay in business, and one of the ways to do so is to find the cheapest labour source possible and to sell their commodities at the best price they possibly can. They must have an edge over their competitors or be forced out of the market. The system forces people to act unethically. For example, it wouldn't take a genius to figure out who would win between a capitalist who decided to feed the world's starving citizens or a capitalist who sold his goods at high prices to wealthy customers. The capitalist feeding the poor would go out of business, whilst the capitalist following the profit motive would be rewarded by becoming even richer. Therefore, a system based on the pursuit of profit and private wealth accumulation cannot be ethical. In fact, it leads to a world where 8 people have as much wealth as 50% of the world's population. So it should not surprise people that this system has killed hundreds of millions of people throughout its long history. It is undemocratic, exploitative, and murderous.